Hi, this is Nick Lalonde, your host of What's Next, making your third act your best act. Today you're going to hear from Tony Warner. Tony has overseen HR for places that employ as many as 2,000 people in his career. Tony came into our conversation today with fantastic perspective on retirement, both from his time in HR as well as personal experiences. What stuck out to me in my conversation with Tony is he's seen people really enjoy retirement, but he's also seen people hate it. He believes it all boils down to visualizing and planning out your ideal retirement. Be sure to listen in when Tony talks about his boss who kept delaying retirement until 72. I hope that you'll enjoy my conversation with Tony as much as I did. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to What's Next, making your third act your best act. I'm your host, Nick Lalonde, and today on the show, I'm super excited. I have Tony Warner with me. Tony, thanks for coming on the show today.
Nick, it's my pleasure.
So, Tony, for anyone that's tuning in and watching us today, they'll see you have an Orioles shirt on. I even noticed that your watch has an Orioles logo on there. Are you the world's biggest Orioles fan?
Not the biggest. Actually, I think my wife is a bigger fan than I am. But today is Orange Wednesday. So, I have to dress up and display my team colors. My wife and I, my wife bought me a season ticket to 29 games back in 2014. So we used to go to maybe a dozen games a year. So we've kind of amped up, going to games. We've developed, our game time friends. We have our seats, in the upper deck, basically the same crew of people that have the same tickets that we do. And so it's a nice getaway. It's good times, with good friends.
Now, did you meet a lot of these people going to games just game after game, or was it more that you've recruited people to come to games with you guys and they
It's
bought season
basically
tickets?
kind of grew organically from going. We went with another couple. And then as we went, we just, met people with the same like-minded attitudes and thoughts. And so we've kind of flocked together, so to speak.
That is so fun. I have Mavs season tickets, and the Mavs are one game away from the NBA Finals right now. And it is fun because when you have season tickets, you start to meet all the people around you. And it's kind of like if you buy a car, you start to see everyone driving that car. Now, everyone I talked to, I didn't know anyone who had Mavs season tickets before. Now, I feel like everyone's got them now. So it's a fun thing to do with other people. I completely agree, and to find community.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious, Tony, one of the reasons why I was so excited to bring you on the show today is you have a very extensive HR background. And so I know you've been with the company for about 2.5 years. You head up an HR for a company of over 500 employees. And one of the things I'm super curious about, so this show is all about what's next, making your third act your best act. And so just to walk you through the acts of life, the first act is about learning. So typically 0 to 30. 30 to 60 years old typically is our second act. And so that's our accumulating, building phase of life. Now you're 69. I would still say you're in the second act of life. But the third act of life,
Thank you, Nick.
the third act of life is where we transition away maybe from work and we find fresh identity and purpose. And so one of the things I'm super curious about, you've seen a lot of people retire over the course of your career, and you've seen people who've done it successfully, and you've seen probably people who have hated their third act of life or their retirement years. Can you speak to maybe some of the common threads or the common traits that you're seeing in people who have retired successfully?
Nick, that's really an excellent question. Uh, I have a good friend who was very active doing triathlons. Uh, and he's done Ironman a couple times. And he retired down to Sarasota, Florida. And he continues to bike, to swim, and to run. Not at the same intensity that he did when he was competing and hoping to, go to Hawaii. But, he's still continuing to do those things. I've also seen where he's expanded some of those activities. Uh, it's allowed him to have a little bit more fulfillment. He's taken up pickleball, and I had never even heard of pickleball until he was telling me about pickleball and, and having to reserve a court, and how, going to pickleball, half the fun is what they do afterwards when they get pickled. Um,
And
so
and just to stop you there, does pickled mean does it involve a few adult beverages?
it doesn't involve adult beverages. And so, he talks about how, in the past, he was always very time retentive. Every moment of his life was very scripted, very detail oriented. To try and compete at that level, he had a training plan for how many miles he needed to run, how many miles he needed to bike, how many yards he needed to swim. And now, you know, he has more leisure time to put in between. And he's finding that he's not running as much, biking as much, but he's enjoying it more because it's more about being in the middle of the pack or in the back of the pack and not trying to be the leader of the pack. And so, I mean, I can relate to that myself the same way as I have a friend who recently took up golf. And he told me that every time he's on the golf course, he thinks about all the things he'd rather be doing than playing golf. And I'm asking, why are you playing golf? And he just thought that's what he should be doing. So, to me, it's an activity without a purpose. So what I've seen is people that are linking that activity to their purpose and tying what they enjoyed earlier to what they're doing currently. And, the focus may be changing, the intensity may be shifting, but they're finding other elements in the activity that makes it very allowable to them.
And so, my understanding correctly that your first friend, right, the first example,
Mhm.
the guy who does triathlons, he's doing pickleball. Um, he's no longer worried about scripting his day out where he has to be the best and he has to train a certain way and maybe eat a certain way. He gets to just enjoy running in the triathlon and swimming and the biking piece. And he doesn't have to be first. He can be in the middle of the pack. He could be in the back of the pack. But it sounds like he's just a lot more present in that activity.
Yeah, I would say, Nick, that's absolutely correct. I look at it from the standpoint that, I mean, I've done Ironman twice. I've swam the Chesapeake Bay a half dozen times. I've done over 100 triathlons, 69 marathons. So, I mean, I understand that intensity of how to manage your time. Uh, and, when he pointed out that he's still doing the same things, now it's just much more enjoyable.
Hmm.
That, to me, that kind of resonated. The light bulb went on. Um,
And so did his purpose shift? So it sounds like maybe previously his purpose was to be the best or to train to be the best. And now maybe it's more about camaraderie. It's more about doing it with other people. Because you mentioned pickleball. The best part of it is not actually playing pickleball. It's getting pickled after with all of his pickleball friends. Is that right?
right. Yes.
And so I'm wondering, what do you think the difference here is? So you mentioned purpose. Do you think there's another common thread as we compare and contrast those two?
Well, I don't want to say companionship, but I think it has to do with a sense of community that, understanding that, you are part of a greater community, that there are people that are like minded, and you're finding solace and comfort in, the thoughts of others and spending time with people that are sharing the same values, the same ideas. Um, and focusing on being positive and doing things that give them a sense of fulfillment.
The other thing that I picked up on here as we're contrasting those two examples is the triathlon example. It almost seems like he was too scripted, right? And he always had somewhere to be, something to do, and he really enjoys just being able to move through his day without it being so scripted. The other example that you gave though, it seems like this guy maybe wants more scripting in some way, right? Because he's always thinking about, okay, maybe I'm not being as efficient with my time as I have been in the past. So one person wants to be less efficient maybe and focus more on the present. One person wants to be a little bit more efficient with their time. Do you think there's any truth to that? Or
Well, Nick, I do. And, the same way as I had a boss who was a few years older, and I worked with him, the last 4 years that he was working. And had intended to retire 4 years earlier than what he did. And the conversations were all about, you have to have a vision for what life looks like after work. What are you going to be doing, beyond work? Is all of your identity, set around what you're doing on a day-to-day basis? What is it that makes you happy? What is it that you find fulfilling? And I think that the people that I've seen that are the most successful, are tying things or tying elements of their life together. And they're allowing a progression of what they're able and capable of doing and finding that there's a richer existence than what they had previously enjoyed. And I think they found it enjoyable before, but I think now they're finding a richer quality of that experience by, not being so caught up in the minute, but allowing the flow and to experience the overall experience to a fuller extent.
when you were walking through that exercise with your former boss and you say, hey, you really have to visualize what you want retirement to look like, what was he visualizing? What does his typical day look like in retirement, or what did he say he wanted it to look like?
Well, he really had very little clue. I mean, he golfed twice a week. He came to work 2 to 3 days a week. Um, you know, the company had 21 different locations. He would surprise 1 to 2 locations, a week to go visit, to kind of drop in and then drop out to let everyone know that he was still around. But, my point to him was, why are you doing this? You know, do you have capable people that are able to run the company? What crisis are you being asked to solve today? If you left tomorrow, what would happen? And he felt that, he was indispensable.
Mm,
And, my point to him is, if you're indispensable, then you can never leave
hmm
and you're going to die with your boots on. And whenever I said that, he would get mad and angry and say, I'm not going to die with my boots on. And I would say, well, you got to start looking at what is it that you find enjoyable? What is it you want to do when you retire? What does life look on the other side of that job? Maybe it's, you're giving back to the community. Maybe you're doing nonprofit work. Maybe you're mentoring. Now, he did get more involved with his church, and I know that he was started mentoring a number of, I'm going to say, I don't want to say fallen souls, because he would drag me into counseling them, in helping them find a job. I would polish their resume. I would work with them on interview skills. And I found that to be rewarding in and of itself. But, to me, I mean, that's how I was then giving.
Hmm.
But, he was sort of orchestrating, but he wasn't really participating. So I
Mm.
think, you have to participate in that post activity.
Hmm. It's so, how old was your boss when he retired?
He was 72.
72. So that's well beyond the normal retirement age. And do you think it played a part that he really hadn't visualized what was after work as to why he retired at 72?
Oh, I'm sure it did. He
Yeah.
had no clue
Yeah.
on what he wanted to do. Um, he had not really given it much thought. He had amassed, a good living, he had a good quality of life.
Yeah.
He had two grown sons, a handful of grandkids. Um, he really wasn't uh, too involved in their lives.
Hmm.
But, it was just, there were gaps that he couldn't identify and that he just was, yeah, I don't want to say lost, but, he needed, I would say he needed to be a little bit more introspective on
Mm.
what was going to give him, joy in his next, what you would call the third phase.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting that you're using your boss as an example. One of the questions that we often ask folks, high achievers who are making their transition from the second act of life to their third act of life, I think in order to really make it a successful transition, they need to ask themselves one question. And it's when you think about work, what does it provide you other than money and financial security? So in your boss's case, right? I mean, it sounds like he had already checked the quality of life box. It sounds like he probably had enough money set aside to where if he retired, it would have been okay, right? He could have stepped away from work. But you mentioned something earlier. You said he was indispensable or he felt indispensable, let's say. And so there's a certain amount of recognition, there's a certain amount of value, right? Relevancy that work provides us that was probably pretty important to him. I'm often finding high achievers need mental stimulation. They need to feel like they're working their brain in a way that pickleball can't, maybe golf can't. What are some other qualities that you think work provided him that we may have not mentioned yet?
Well, I think for him, it was the status of being the company president.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had reached that. He had owned his own company, left that or sold that company and went to work at a nonprofit. And he was been the company president for over 20 years.
Mm,
And he had watched the company, grow from, well, I mean, the company had tripled in size over 20 years. And he was very much about his legacy of
hmm.
how, the company without him probably would have faltered and failed, and how there are times that he felt the only reason it survived was his strength of character and his indomitable will to make things happen.
And
Now, I would tell him that was just his ego talking. But I mean, there was an element of truth that, that you find that progress is sometimes made by people that they're not willing to accept what others are willing to accept. And, they do see things a little bit in the future. And he saw enough in the future to be able to convince and lead people over that gulf to where the company was profitable, successful. I was brought in to strengthen the management team so that he could leave.
mm,
And, part of when I was recruited to go there, the board was very much focused on what I was doing in building out the bench.
I'm curious. So at 72, when he hung it up, right, there was a piece of him that felt like he was irreplaceable. It was a huge part of his identity. And PwC did a study, and they found that three-fourths of business owners are profoundly unhappy a year after the sale of their business or exit from their business. When he exited the business, did you keep up with him that next year or next 2 years?
I've kept up with him as well as a couple other people.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, his son bought a franchise. He's, spending time on the franchise. So, he's still working, but I'm going to say sort of supervising his son. I've told him that, that's a great way to kill the relationship with your kids. But he's got to find his own path.
Interesting. So he separated from work at 72.
Right.
And how long after did he buy this franchise?
I'm going to say within 6 months, he bought it for his son, his oldest son.
But he's really still very involved in maybe the day to day and supervising his son who works in the business. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So it sounds like maybe there was a lack of introspection in terms of, maybe what life looked like beyond, the second to third act. Maybe he just said, hey, I need to be working still in some capacity.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think it really comes down to, the quality of your vision. What does life look like? I mean, my mother retired at 55 for health reasons.
Mm-hmm.
She died 4 years later. She took care of my youngest sister's kids, and she was miserable, and it really, um, again, money really wasn't necessarily the problem. It was just the overall quality of life, what they were looking to do, where they were living, the activities or the lack of activities. Um, I mean, she basically got up every day and would read and watch soaps, take care of my sister's kids. A good relief for my sister, but not so much for her.
So your mom retired at 55. When did she pass away?
Before she was 59, between 58 and 59.
And I think with longevity, there's a lot of studies that talk about things that aid to longevity, whether it's camaraderie. I think happiness is a big thing. Do you think that there was, just with the fact that she viewed retirement as miserable and really didn't enjoy it, do you think that affected her health at all?
Oh, I would say it very definitely did. I think, for her, the lack of identity, the lack of any real skills or hobbies. Suddenly, she woke up one day and said, now I'm retired. I reached that pinnacle that I've been working for her for 35 years. I reached that point. So here I am. Now, what in the hell do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think she spent the rest of her life trying to figure out what in the hell do I do now?
It's funny, Tony. Sometimes when I talk to folks who are high achievers and I say, hey, what does your third act look like? Right? Visualize that for me. In some cases, they sound like your former boss where they've never really spent time thinking about this. You have more examples, I feel like, you can pull from than just about anyone I've talked to, right? Both personally, right? You've had family and friends that have been an example for you, as well as people who have retired in your profession. I'm curious, what are you going to do to ensure that you have the best transition from your second act of life to your third act of life?
Well, I believe I need to plan it out. Um, what you don't know about me, Nick, is that um, my wife is 7 years younger than I am. I've talked about I want to retire at least 2 years before she does so that I can make the transition from my workaday life to my uh, next phase or my lack of workaday life. And that I just can't, it's not going to be that quick. It needs to be a process. We've started talking a little bit about um, going to a reduced schedule. Could I work 2 or 3 days a week? What would that look like? How would I want to spend my, those days off where I'm not going into the office? How would I uh, make that transition? The same way as I worked at a college and I had 9 people that worked for me in HR. And I passed a rule and I said, everyone in HR has to get their HR certification. And I'm going to give everybody a year to get that certification. And when that year is up, I'm gonna make some hard decisions. So I facilitated all 9 people. I got everyone to take classes. Every Friday afternoon, we would have a study session for the last 2 hours of the day. After, I want to say it was 4 months, there was a testing period, and all 9 took the test. 5 passed, 4 did not. Uh, so now there's 6 of us working with those that didn't pass, and we're working with them. And then we got 2 more to pass. The other 2 just said, I'm never going to pass. I don't care. Fire me. Do whatever you will. And I said, well, at the end of the year, I'm not going to fire you. But, you need to you need to understand you weren't doing this for me. You were doing this for yourself. I've got 7 people now that are in greater control over their future. Now, the college ended up transitioning. The college president left. A new college president came in. The new college president said, Tony, you're a nice guy, but I want you to know I'm bringing in my own people. You're not one of my people. And I said, fine, not a problem. I was able to leave within a month,
Mm,
to a job with a brighter future, more money, more vacation, all the perks that I was looking for.
mm-hmm,
The 7 people who had gotten their certification, all of them left within 3 months. All of
mm,
them managed to transition to a job that they had previously thought was not attainable.
mm-hmm,
And I felt a huge amount of accomplishment
mm-hmm.
uh, with those 7. Now I'm still in contact with the 2 that are still at the college. They're still in the same role that they were uh, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So, nothing has changed for them. Those 7 that left, I'm still in contact with um, 5 of them on a regular basis, 2 every now and again. And there are a couple, 2 of them that, are working at much larger organizations, um, in much more prestigious roles than what I'm in today. And I take great pride in seeing how their career progressed. And I feel that part of what I've done was part of that. Now, I've tried to do that every place that I've gone.
Mm,
And so I'm in the process of doing that here so that, when it is time for me to leave, the company's going to be in good hands.
hmm
They're going to have a very solid bench,
hmm
that the systems, procedures, and processes are there, that, I can go away and not have to worry.
hmm hmm I love that. You're really setting your company up for success when you do decide to transition out of the company. But it sounds like to me you're taking the path of decelerating. So a lot of the high achievers I speak to, they're running at 100 miles per hour today with their work. And what I'm hearing you say is, Nick, we're having conversations of me stepping back to maybe working 2 or 3 days. And so with those 2 or 3 days, it's almost like I'm getting a taste for what does this extra time look like that I might have in my third act? What do I enjoy? What are my hobbies? And I want to make sure that I have at least 2 years before my wife retires to enjoy this, to enjoy being fully retired before she's actually retired as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And it sounds like, just going back to your story when you were talking about the 9 HR folks, I think the lesson in that story is, by planning. So they had to do some planning, right? They had to sacrifice their short term, their time to study and get this certification. It set them up for long term success. And it's the same thing with your retirement, right? If you're thinking about it today, right, the transition between your second and your third act, and you're intentional about it, you're much more likely to have success long term in this third act of life. Is that the lesson that you would maybe take away from that as well?
Uh, Nick, absolutely. I've seen and I've worked for people that have been very successful at work and had a horrible personal life. And I could never understand, how can you be so good at one thing and so horrible elsewhere? And the conclusion that I came to is that it comes down to, both partly it's character and their values, but it's the understanding of themselves and being able to be congruent to who they are and to understand how they think, how they work, and how they believe. That when you can put those elements together, you can find maybe not the Holy Grail, but at least a grail that is very satisfying.
Tony, this has been so fun having you on today. I've really enjoyed getting to hear your perspective on retirement, and just hearing both your personal experiences as well as just in the workplace. You've gotten to see so many people make this transition. I'm confident that this will be a good transition for you, because I know you're going to visualize, what you want your third act to look like, and you're going to be very intentional with the planning.
Well, thank you, Nick. I certainly hope so.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show, Tony. It was great having you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. You have a great day, Nick.
Take care, sir.
Thanks.
Bye.